So what I have for you today is a heuristic that I'm presenting for the rhetorical analysis of what I'm calling horror counterstories. And I'll get into that in a moment here. Quick aside, most of you were here when I presented last year, which is fabulous. Because last year's presentation is where I'm picking up. So last year, I presented on horror, and I was trying to redefine horror, because the definitions of horror that I was running into, both the formal ones that are academic and the informal ones that you run into people on the street, like this is horror. Nothing was really cutting it for me in terms of the breadth of the current breadth of horror across all of the subgenres of horror entertainment. And so I worked to redefine it. Since then, I've tweaked my definition a little bit. So the version I'm presenting to you today is a little different than it was last year, but this is the definition I'm running with right now. That a story is horror if it possesses monstrosity, and we know that there is monstrosity if the audience is compelled to feel this thing called vertigo. Vertigo is a word I borrow from Dr. Asa Mittman, who teaches at this university, and vertigo is the sense that you feel when some fundamental pillar of your identity or your worldview or the way you perceive things around you is challenged or directly threatened by an opposing force. That results in this feeling called vertigo. Super broad, but so is horror, and so we go. So this definition is what I've been working with as I've been trying to analyze horror. Monstrosity, as we've just discussed, is at the core of it. But in order to really understand monstrosity, we need a touchstone to the horror story, and that touchstone is the protagonist. Horror is a genre where we as the audience are meant to emotionally identify with the protagonist. So if the protagonist feels horror, feels fear, feels dread, in theory, we as the audience are supposed to feel those things as well. And then this other aspect I threw in here at the bottom, audience, that's me, that's you. That's the researcher. I know that in academia, we're supposed to strive for objectivity with a capital O, and I simply do not believe that exists. And as someone who is an advocate of horror, I believe it strengthens an analysis of horror for the researcher to tap into aspects of the horror story that affected them in subjective ways, and to follow those threads. So I've been working with this model to analyze Mexican Gothic. Our hero in Mexican Gothic is Noemi Taboada. She is a Mexican socialite. She is a young woman, and she is at least in part Mazatec Indian, which becomes disturbingly relevant to the plot of this story. The monstrosity in this story is found in the Doyle family, very white. They are English colonizers who have been lingering in Mexico for far too long. Their family is extremely patriarchal. It is unashamedly misogynistic, and they're racist. Don't let the words trip you up. They're racist, and they support their racism through eugenics. The way that I've lined these points up is intentionally to correspond with These are the aspects of monstrosity that are threatening the corresponding identities of Nomi Taboada. So this is how my analysis started, and I continued on. And the presentation I have for you today is the story of how my analysis changed. Because during my research, I came across this podcast episode. This is an interview with Silvia Moreno Garcia, the author of Mexican Gothic. And what I realized while listening to this podcast episode is that my understanding of Mexican Gothic, which I thought was this big, is actually about this big. Because what I saw in this podcast episode is that there are things that Silvia Moreno Garcia is doing with the story that are outside of the fact that it is a story. I don't know if that makes sense. Mexican Gothic tells a story, but it's also doing other things that are impacting the world and people in it in much more real ways than we tend to associate with a mere story. So some of the things that she's doing with Mexican Gothic is she's working to correct Euro-American misconceptions of Mexico's colonial history, and I confess I was corrected because I was wrong. She's working against a tendency, particularly in publishing, that tends to pigeonhole Mexican authors into particular genres, especially magic realism, which is why she called her book Mexican Gothic. It's right there in the title. And then finally, there are very real ways, because of the way that the publishing industry works, there are very real ways that the fact that she published this horror novel makes it easier for people of color to publish in the horror genre. Because the horror genre is historically white and in many ways remains that way. So these are, I'm losing my words. I learned to think about Mexican Gothic differently through this podcast. I didn't know it at the time, but this podcast was teaching me to think of Mexican Gothic as a composite story. And by that I mean that stories don't exist in isolation. Every story is necessarily drawing upon other related stories or data or social conversations or motivations or whatever it is and those things are necessary in acquiring an accurate understanding of the story. And then my strategy changed again because I read this article, which introduced me to the idea of counterstory, which I'd been unfamiliar with up to that point. To understand counterstory, I need to back up a step and talk about stock story. A stock story is a narrative that comes from a group that's in a position of cultural dominance. That tends to be white, male, heteronormative, Euro-American. Stock stories work to naturalize that cultural dominance. Pretend like that's just the way it should be. Stock stories also render invisible the perspectives of marginalized persons, often people of color. So, a counterstory, you might infer, is the opposite of that. Counterstories work to refute the rhetoric and so-called objectivity of stock stories, and they also work to return marginalized groups to places of cultural visibility. And so, with those three things happening, it hit me, oh my God, Mexican Gothic is a counterstory. There's more to it than this. I had to be brief for this presentation, but this is one of the ways that Mexican Gothic is a counterstory. It invokes a stock story that is called the doctrine of discovery. Basically what this means is, this is the really, really antiquated idea that if a colonizer finds land that is unused, that they can take it and kill for it and use it for whatever they want. That's the doctrine of discovery. This novel is a counterstory to that. I'm glossing over a ton here, but at least in the ways that, that the story shows the horrors of colonialism. The way that colonialism destroys the land and harms indigenous peoples in all sorts of ways. So this rewrites the idea that, that the doctrine of discovery is a right, and changes that to it's an abuse. So this is a counterstory. So I realized at this point, I have a lot more going on here than just analyzing in terms of horror. I am analyzing in terms of horror, but I also have counterstory in there, and I have composite story. And this is the start of the heuristic that I've been working with since then. So counterstory, we've already touched on this briefly, but my process for analyzing counterstory is you start by identifying the opposition, you have the protagonist, and you have some sort of opposing force. Not always an antagonist, but there's something. Invocation is identifying the stock stories that are invoked in the story, and then refutation, identifying how those stock stories are countered throughout the duration of the counterstory. With composite story, I also broke this down into 3 areas. We have the storyteller. What are their motives? That's where I started. So it seemed to make sense to me to start there. Dialogues are data, literature, social commentary. It's kind of my catch-all for the other information being referenced in the story. And then the impact. What is the story doing? Outside of the fact that it is a story, what does it do in tangible, real ways in our world? When you see it all together, this is what it looks like. Synthesis is really hard to describe because I think synthesis will change with every story that's being analyzed. It's hard for me to create a template for it. But in general, what I'm trying to do with synthesis is to illustrate that these 3 categories, which I treat as separate, they really blur together a lot of the time, and they influence each other in sometimes subtle and sometimes surprising ways. I mentioned earlier that horror is a historically white-dominated genre, and because of that, much of the classics of horror are incredibly problematic. I do not have time to get into it right now, but if you ask me later about any of these, I am happy to talk about what exactly is fucked up with it. Especially that last one, don't get me started. Fortunately, the horror genre is changing. There's starting to be a lot more stories that are moving away from the whiteness, away from the masculinity, away from the heteronormativity. Basically, horror counter stories are starting to become a lot more common. My hope in creating this heuristic is that it will be applied in the future to other stories. I've only applied it to Mexican Gothic, so Mexican Gothic is all I know. But I'm hoping that there are other applications and other potential with this heuristic beyond just Mexican Gothic.